Chapter 23. Synthetic cannabinoids, spice, K2 and others. A few key facts. Synthetic cannabinoids are synthetic substances initially designed as research chemicals, looking to mimic the effects of compounds found in herbal cannabis. They are cannabinoids related to but not identical to those found in herbal cannabis, or the endocannabinoids that we produce ourselves. They're popular particularly among homeless and prison populations. They're consumed by smoking, vaping, or putting them into tea and drinking. Some effects include elevated mood, relaxation, perceptual alterations, increased appetite, aggression, vomiting, and dangerously high body temperatures and sometimes seizures. Perhaps you've heard of spice. No, not the mysterious drug from David Lynch's sci-fi movie Dune, which is worth checking out if you've not seen it, if you're a fan of incomprehensibility and Sting in Little Blue Pants. But slang for synthetic cannabinoids, a group of substances that have been growing in popularity in the UK and elsewhere since they first started appearing for sale in the early 2000s. Initially developed as research chemicals, they were part of a group of chemicals that grew up on the fringes of legality, certainly in the UK. Until 2016's Psychoactive Substances Bill, drugs were classed as controlled on a case-by-case basis. A small tweak to a compound, and it would no longer be covered by the ban, meaning substances could be technically marketed as a legal high. A synthetic cannabinoid would appear, be banned, was tweaked, and reappeared as a slightly different substance, no longer controlled. And they made a whole lot of newspaper headlines along the way, as we'll see. What are they? Sometimes referred to as new or novel psychoactive substances, NPS, synthetic cannabinoids is a collective term that refers to a wide range of different substances that affect cannabinoid receptors in the brain, and sometimes the cannabinoid receptors outside the central nervous system too. Whilst they share some similarities to herbal cannabis, and the more extensively researched compounds in the cannabis plant, such as THC, the effects of many synthetic cannabinoids on the body and brain can be more extreme, so they shouldn't just be considered lab-made versions of herbal cannabis, or synthetic cannabis. Synthetic cannabinoids are sold under many names, but spice is one of the most widely known, and is often used as an umbrella term for all types of synthetic cannabinoids in the UK. However, there is regional and national variation in the terms used to describe synthetic cannabinoids, of which some estimate there are over 400 types available, and other names the substances are sold under have included K2, Joker, Black Mamba, Cowboy Kush, and Chronic. Synthetic cannabinoids are often sold sprayed onto a dried plant material resembling tobacco leaf. This is then smoked or made into a tea. It's also possible to vape synthetic cannabinoids dissolved in an appropriate fluid. In the USA, some vaping liquids sold as cannabidiol, CBD, a compound found in cannabis, have been found to contain synthetic cannabinoids. Synthetic cannabinoids were initially appealing because they were perceived as a cheap and legal alternative to cannabis. As they were often sold in shops or online, they were generally easier to get hold of than cannabis, and the legal status may have meant some people thought they were safer. In the USA, they gained popularity as they were not detectable in drug screening tests, meaning people who were regularly subject to such tests, university and school athletes, members of the armed forces, individuals on parole, healthcare professionals and shift workers, might have been tempted to use these over herbal cannabis, which was easily detected in screens, up to several weeks after last use. Similarly to the USA, synthetic cannabinoids became popular in prisons in the UK because they didn't have the familiar odour of cannabis, weren't detected by drug screens or sniffer dogs, and were easy to smuggle in, either inside the body or impregnated onto paper or fabrics. What are the short-term effects? If a person smokes or otherwise consumes a synthetic cannabinoid, they may experience intoxication that feels similar-ish to that from herbal cannabis. For example, they might have an elevated mood and feelings of relaxation. They might also experience perceptual alterations. It's likely to increase a person's appetite and can make people feel sleepy, although it has also been associated with increasing aggressiveness and violence. Some people may report psychotic-like symptoms including confusion, paranoia, anxiety, and hallucinations. So far, so like cannabis, but people who use synthetic cannabinoids report psychotic-like experiences much more frequently and more severely than those who use herbal cannabis. Synthetic cannabinoids can induce nausea and vomiting. There are even case reports of individuals experiencing hyperemesis after synthetic cannabinoid use. Hyperemesis is a condition characterized by severe and prolonged vomiting, often requiring hospitalization as it can lead to dehydration. Synthetic cannabinoids also increase heart rate and have been linked to risk of seizures. Use of these substances has been responsible for mass poisonings and many trips to emergency rooms across the USA and Europe, often with symptoms that are not seen after herbal cannabis use. For example, there is some evidence that synthetic cannabinoids at high doses can cause an individual's body temperature to rise very rapidly, which can put the person at risk of coma and damage to their vital organs. Doctors have reported cases of patients with kidney damage, heart attacks, or stroke. Synthetic cannabinoid intoxication has also been implicated in cases of violence, leading some to believe that it causes the behaviour, although this is hard to be certain about for reasons I'll go into later. What are the longer-term effects? We know little about the longer-term impact of regular synthetic cannabinoid use. Synthetic cannabinoids first became popular recreationally in the early 2000s, but the research community took a while to catch up with what people were using, and they only began to be identified by drug sample tests several years later. This is often the case, particularly with new substances, where molecular tweaks can mean new variants emerge all the time. It can be hard for research to keep up and keep on top of understanding the effects of them. If people are smoking synthetic cannabinoids sprayed onto dried plant material, then it is likely that some similar risks to that of smoking tobacco may be expected due to the nature of inhaling burning plant matter. And this might lead to other harms too, which I'll talk about in a minute. There are a growing number of case studies indicating that synthetic cannabinoids can trigger psychosis above and beyond the transient symptoms seen during intoxication. These case reports are also seen after use of herbal cannabis, although many people researching these substances believe that the risk of psychosis is far greater for synthetic cannabinoids than for herbal cannabis. A recent paper published by researchers across Europe recruited 367 individuals who used herbal cannabis or synthetic cannabinoids and gave them a battery of questionnaires. The 238 synthetic cannabinoid users were different from the 129 herbal cannabis users in a number of ways. Synthetic cannabinoid use was associated with higher scores on all measures of general or specific psychopathology the researchers measured, including insomnia, mania, and a global measure investigating symptoms of a number of different mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, psychosis symptoms, and paranoia. It is worth pointing out that around 80% of the synthetic cannabinoid group were also using herbal cannabis, and were more likely than the herbal cannabis group to be using a number of other illicit substances. Even so, in this sample, synthetic cannabinoid use was predictive of up to over 5 times greater risk of poor mental health. This study cannot tell us about causality. It's impossible to tell whether people with poorer mental health are drawn to using synthetic cannabinoids, or whether the synthetic cannabinoids might be increasing the risk, but it's potentially worrying nonetheless. People working in emergency departments have published articles detailing how challenging it can be to diagnose synthetic cannabinoid intoxication. Firstly, this is because synthetic cannabinoids will often not be picked up by a typical drug screening procedure. Also, physicians have noted that symptoms of synthetic cannabinoid intoxication can look very similar to that of serotonin syndrome, a disorder that can occur after consumption of certain medications, such as SSRIs to treat depression, or other intoxicants such as MDMA. Both the syndrome and synthetic cannabinoid intoxication can manifest as a fever, a rapid pulse, confusion, and at higher levels can cause organ failure or even death. As such, it can be hard for emergency medics to work out what treatment a person needs, particularly if they are unable to provide information about what they have consumed, either because they don't know or because the severity of their intoxication means they cannot communicate it. Clinicians working with individuals who have used synthetic cannabinoids have noticed an increase in stroke-like presentation at hospitals from people using the substances, due to what are referred to as thromboembolic episodes, which refers to when a blood clot or blood clots form in blood vessels. Clots then move with the flow of blood and can block arteries. Hence, people being brought into the emergency room with symptoms similar to that of stroke, which is caused by a blockage of blood flow to the brain. Synthetic cannabinoid use has been linked to the risk of injury to the kidneys, but again, these findings are all from case studies rather than from larger-scale research designs such as cohort studies. All this means that it is hard to say whether these are being caused by the substance itself or whether the individuals in question have other underlying factors that might also be at play. And given what we know about the people who predominantly use synthetic cannabinoids, in the UK it's largely limited to the prison population and among homeless people, it's plausible that these are groups who are already in poorer health than the general population as a whole. Any kidney damage or other potential risk factors from synthetic cannabinoids could conceivably be due to other factors related to being homeless or in prison. It's incredibly challenging to unpick. Having said that, the potential link between synthetic cannabinoids and kidney problems is deemed to be important enough that doctors are now advised to consider synthetic cannabinoid use in patients with unexplained acute kidney injury, particularly if they might have other risk factors that would suggest synthetic cannabinoid use. Stopping using synthetic cannabinoids can be unpleasant. Individuals who use them have reported that they experience come-downs after taking them that can be quite extreme, with symptoms including suicidal ideation, thinking about killing yourself. There is also mounting evidence that synthetic cannabinoids might be more likely to lead to dependence than herbal cannabis. Regular users report experiencing withdrawal symptoms, some of which are similar to those reported by heavy users of herbal cannabis. Things such as a lack of appetite, feeling irritable, and inability to sleep well. However, some of the withdrawal symptoms reported by synthetic cannabinoid users are more severe, for example, agitation, anxiety, and even seizures. This is another reason that treatment services can struggle to treat people who use synthetic cannabinoids. Myths and misconceptions. Despite synthetic cannabinoids not having been around for very long, there are already a number of myths and misconceptions that exist around them. Synthetic cannabinoids are just cannabis that's been made in a factory rather than grown. While synthetic cannabinoids and the naturally occurring cannabinoids found in herbal cannabis both have an effect on the endocannabinoid system in our brains and bodies, this doesn't mean that they're the same compounds. Broadly, synthetic cannabinoids do mimic the effects of THC, the most widely researched cannabinoid that's found in herbal cannabis, and at a molecular level they often look quite similar to THC. However, a slight variation in the molecule can cause a profound change in intoxication effects. In particular, there's evidence to suggest that the way in which synthetic cannabinoids interact with receptors in the brain is different to that of cannabinoids found in herbal cannabis. THC in herbal cannabis is what's known as a partial agonist of cannabinoid receptors in the brain. This means that when THC binds to receptors, it activates or increases activity at that particular site in the brain, but only to a partial degree and not fully. Many synthetic cannabinoids are full receptor agonists, meaning they have a much stronger effect at a cellular level in the brain, leading to differences in activation of neural pathways in the brain, different levels of neurotransmitters being present in the gaps or synapses between neurons, and therefore having dissimilar, stronger effects. Not only that, but some synthetic cannabinoids also bind to a variety of other non-cannabinoid receptors, which might contribute to some of their other reported behavioural and physiological effects. So, while synthetic cannabinoids might be based on herbal cannabis, their effects are usually much more extreme and unpleasant. It's a myth. Synthetic cannabinoids are safer than cannabis because they are legal. This one flips the usual "it's natural so it's safer" myth on its head. Some individuals are perhaps unsurprisingly swayed by a substance's legal status, assuming this must bear some relation to risk from consuming it. As is clear from all the descriptions in this chapter, while we know less about the effects of synthetic cannabinoids than we do about herbal cannabis, all the evidence to date suggests that the risk of harm from synthetic cannabinoids is likely to be substantially higher than for herbal cannabis. Not only that, but there are further risks due to how synthetic cannabinoids are prepared. As I mentioned earlier, synthetic cannabinoids are often sprayed onto plant matter to allow them to be smoked. This is a pretty imprecise method of distribution of a substance, and as such, what can happen is that some pieces of plant matter become super strength, while others might have almost no psychoactive substance on them at all. This can make judging a dose extremely difficult, above and beyond the usual challenges of not knowing for sure what you're purchasing or consuming when you buy an illicit substance. There are no regulations controlling production of these substances, and they are often prepared by people without training in unsafe or unhygienic locations. Even before synthetic cannabinoids were restricted by law, they were always marketed as products that were not safe for human consumption, and the harms from synthetic cannabinoids have increased with each generation created. Synthetic cannabinoids were originally created as a scientific research tool to aid understanding of the endocannabinoid system in relation to factors ranging from brain function to appetite, immune function, or psychiatric disorders. The potential for intoxication was not a primary research interest. However, once synthetic cannabinoids began to be made by underground chemists, the intoxication potential was prioritized. Products around at the moment are much more potent and therefore harmful than they were in the early 2000s when synthetic cannabinoids first started to be sold. It's also worth reiterating that legal highs were never really legal. Although the products were able to be sold legally for a time, this was only if they were clearly marked as not for human consumption. Legal never meant regulated, and it certainly never meant safe. It's a myth. Spice makes you a zombie. In the UK, there have been many headlines over recent years where synthetic cannabinoids have been held up as causing a zombie-like state in people who use them. These stories often focus on people who are homeless, who are highly visible in city and town centres, and who might be attracted to using synthetic cannabinoids in order to cope with the realities of living on the streets. It's been particularly striking in Manchester in the northwest of England and Wrexham in Wales, among other places. It's certainly the case that synthetic cannabinoids can induce symptoms that make it difficult to move or difficult to sit upright, but referring to people as zombies is hugely dehumanising. You wouldn't see headlines referring to people so intoxicated on alcohol that they couldn't stand as zombies. So what is different about synthetic cannabinoids? Perhaps it's the group of people who are using it. In the UK, the number of people who are homeless has increased dramatically over recent years. Homeless people are often dehumanised and even demonised by the media and authorities, and the attitudes of the general public towards people who are homeless is sometimes less than compassionate. We are advised not to give homeless people money, for example, although this is not based on any evidence. While synthetic cannabinoids might induce severe intoxication effects, and to see someone standing immobile or slumped in a busy city centre can look strange and disturbing, perhaps it is not surprising that people living in extremely challenging and unpleasant circumstances seek out intoxication that can lead to feelings of dissociation and depersonalisation. And these people should be offered support rather than being dehumanised to the point of referring to them as undead. The words and phrases that we use to describe other people can lead to stigmatisation and exclusion, and this can have a real impact on public attitudes and the health and safety of targeted groups. Research has shown that when more stigmatising terms are used to describe people who use drugs, these people are then more likely to be perceived as having brought their current situation upon themselves, and people are more likely to endorse punitive responses rather than health-based responses. Certainly, people who use synthetic cannabinoids have been subject to dehumanising treatment. In the UK, there have been attacks on individuals who have used synthetic cannabinoids, attacks that have been filmed and put on social media. Sheffield Council issued a statement calling for people to stop posting pictures and videos online. On Facebook, an event calling for Spice zombie bashing in Doncaster was created and widely shared. This abhorrent behaviour is cruel and will certainly not help anyone who is probably already struggling. It's a myth. Do synthetic cannabinoids have any medical uses? Synthetic cannabinoids were first developed by researchers, and perhaps this makes some sense, given how many illnesses herbal cannabis has been purported to be able to prevent, treat, or cure. Scientists and pharmaceutical companies have been interested in whether cannabinoids can be synthesized that might have the beneficial effects while minimizing the psychoactive or negative side effects. Synthetic cannabinoids were investigated as a potential treatment for pain, neurodegenerative diseases, and even cancer. For example, the drug nabilone is a synthetic cannabinoid that is used to treat patients with chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. However, most that were created had too many undesired side effects and were discontinued, only to be picked up by underground chemists and synthesized for recreational use. Once this occurred, the psychoactive effects were prioritized, meaning the most potent compounds were the most popular.